When I was 14, my high school thought it would be a good idea to take a bunch of us New York City kids into the Catskills for a day. The idea was to introduce us to nature since some of us had spent our entire lives living in the concrete jungle that is New York City. Seriously, a lot of us had only ever seen forests and farms on the TV or in movies, and now that I'm older, I realize how potentially damaging that is. I honestly feel like human beings are supposed to be in contact with nature, that it makes us happier, healthier, and gives us a sense of place. But I'll quit my rambling and get on with the story. So one super early morning, we load onto our school bus for the drive out into the Catskills. This is in like November too, so it was still dark when I got up and the sun had barely risen when the driver got us on the road. I was excited at the time. I had aspirations to be in the military, and the idea of getting to wander around the woods was such a cool concept to me at the time. In the end, it actually turned out to be pretty boring and really tiring. We walked for hours and hours with our teacher telling us about different kinds of trees, animals, and weather systems that the area was home to. But we didn't even really get to see any of those animals aside from the odd squirrel that was squirreling away nuts. It turns out some of them don't hibernate at all, unlike a lot of woodland creatures. Like I said, it was all much more boring than I first thought. That was, right up until I saw something carved into a tree. It was carved in really deep, obviously with some kind of knife or something, right through the bark and into the wood. I'd never seen anything like it before, and it wasn't like I wasn't a smart kid. I used to read about different religions and occult stuff quite a lot, so I was pretty confused as to what it was. To describe it, it looked like a rough figure 8, but with like dots and lines carved around it in certain places, so that it kind of looked like an octopus, only not at all at the same time. I know that makes literally zero sense, and I wish this was when camera phones were a thing because I'd probably still have the pictures with me to link people to. Out of curiosity, I call my teacher over and ask her if she recognized it. She gives the thing pretty much the same look as I figured I had, just having no idea what she's looking at, then obviously tells me no, that she's never seen anything like it before. But that in all likelihood it's something a hunter carved into the trees so they wouldn't get lost. I'd not really heard of anyone doing that before, but I kind of figured she knew best, so I dropped the whole thing and just followed the group as we walked on. After a little while, we ended up walking right to the edge of a cliff face near a mountain. It was this huge wall of rock that just seemed to rise up out of the earth, covered in moss and stuff. Our teacher starts pointing at the rock and telling us how we can tell how old it is by the different kinds of rock that the thing was made up of, but few of us were really listening. I only really started paying attention myself as we walked along the cliff face, and I saw something familiar on it. Something big, too. It was the same symbol we'd seen carved into the tree, only like I said, this one was much, much bigger. Again, I showed our teacher, only this time, she didn't seem so calmly curious, and she seemed as freaked out as I did. Not only that, but the entire class saw it this time, but with it being the first time seeing it, they weren't nearly as scared, just the same curious I was. I asked the teacher quietly who might carve something like that into the rock, who might have the time or the skills or the equipment. She just told me she didn't know, but not to mention the ones that we'd seen carved into the trees. Plural. She used the plural, and it honestly scared me more than it should have. I'd only seen the one carved into the tree, but she'd obviously seen a lot more than I had. I just found myself hoping we'd be heading back soon. It was early afternoon by that time, and I wondered just how scary the woods would be after dark. Thankfully, I started heading back towards the bus not long after eating lunch. A little while into our walk, one kid stops the teacher and tells her he needs to go to the bathroom. It wasn't an ideal situation by any means, but with the kid being a dude, it was pretty easy to remedy. Teacher just tells him to go into the bushes nearby and deal with it, so he does. A few minutes later, we hear him tearing through the bushes back towards us, panting as he ran. He emerges with this terrified look in his eyes, like I've never seen anyone so scared before, not in real life. The teacher runs over and starts asking him what the deal is, but he can hardly get his words out. He just keeps breathing real fast, in and out, like rocking back and forth on the spot like he was losing his mind. The teacher is telling him to breathe, calm down and focus, and tell us what he saw. What he said shook our group to the core. There was a man, a real old man, or not so old. He had white hair and a beard, and he didn't have any clothes on, but he was covered in like tattoos. Oh my God. Oh God, what if he saw me? What if he's following us? The teacher had to quiet the kid before a full-blown panic attack took over the group, and we hurried back to the bus without stopping to look at anything at all. Nothing else happened on the walk back to the bus, but thank God. But I remember being really curious as to what the kid thought he saw when he went to the bathroom, and I foolishly asked. He told me exactly the same thing, only went into a little more detail about the tattoos and stuff. I asked him if he remembered what they looked like, to draw one of them if he could. He took out a notebook and pen, closed his eyes for a moment so he could really recall. Then he drew something rough that I couldn't quite make out at first, but when he showed it, it was clear. It was a bunch of dots and lines, with a clear figure 8 in the middle. Back when I was in high school, the history class I was a part of organized a field trip to an old Civil War fort down in Louisiana. The place was called Fort Randolph, and basically, the whole thing was built on the edges of a huge swamp. Despite being destroyed by Union forces after the war, there's quite a large facility in place where tour groups can trace the layout of the fort on wooden bridges that snake through the trees. I was 17 at the time of the trip, and if I'm honest, I was a terrible student. I didn't really want to go, but anything was better than going to school, so naturally I took that permission slip home and told my parents that not only was I really excited to go, but that it would really help raise my GPA. They signed and gave me the money to go without so much as a second thought. But the whole thing was so boring. I didn't care at all about Civil War history, I still don't really, so trying to have this swamp-dwelling tour guide teach me was an exercise in futility. It didn't help that he had the most monotone drawl in existence either. Seriously, the guy could have put a meth head to sleep with that voice of his. The only relief was that a buddy of mine from the same class had come down with us, pretty much the same reasons as me. He hated school, but unlike me, he had the presence of mind to bring some relief. At the lunch break, he opened up his backpack to show me the small bottle of bourbon he'd stolen from his alcoholic father's stash. We planned on sneaking off at one point once we got a chance to, but a few hours after lunch, our teacher gave us the best news imaginable. We're wrapping up a few hours early here, but the bus isn't due for a little while yet, so kids, just explore the site here at your leisure, just don't stray too far into the swamp for your own safety. And it was music to our ears. We'd finally get away from the gaggles of nerds and actually do something fun with the day. So off we went to a quieter corner of the site before hopping over the wooden bridge thing and darting away between the trees to find a place to drink in peace. When we found somewhere, my buddy revealed that it wasn't just booze he'd been packing. He brought something to smoke too. Something we really should not have been smoking during a field trip. He'd had to wrap it up in a bunch of plastic to stop it from stinking the bus out on the way down. And once we got going, I started to feel really, really uneasy. There's something inherently creepy about that area of Louisiana. All the stuff that hangs from the trees, the bugs, the wildlife. It's amazing anyone can live out there at all. I mean, no offense, but good God, the humidity. I did not factor that into the whole drinking and smoking thing. I think I was sweating out bourbon before we'd even finished the bottle. My buddy had a few smokes with him, and although it didn't look like we had time to light them all up, he gave me one to take home with me. So I had one in my pocket while we were smoking up, and here's something in the distance. Something that got louder and louder as we strained our ears to listen. Neither of us could quite make out what it was, like this faint buzzing sound. I put it down to the inebriation, and then, in one grim moment of realization, I recognized it as a radio, and what was buzzing over it was the unmistakable sound of police chatter. We actually caught sight of this big, burly Louisiana sheriff's deputy scanning the trees for something, and that something being us. "They must be around here, deputy. I swear this is where I smelled it." Some freaking Karen's voice, obviously the one to have snitched in the first place, and we just bolted. I remember separating from my buddy almost immediately, getting it in my head that I could circle around the area and be back with our field trip group before they even really knew we were gone. But when I stopped for a second and heard that the deputy was following, not far behind either, he must have caught sight of me as I ran and was hot on my trail as opposed to my buddies. I was terrified. I had it in my head that I'd spend like a week in some backwater Louisiana jailhouse, getting the snot beat out of me on the daily. I kept running, but I was way too messed up to get away. So when I saw a hole in the dirt underneath one of those big old trees, I saw my chance to hide myself away. Looking back, it was probably the dumbest thing I'd ever done in my life, but not for the reason you might expect. Because as I'm in the hole in the dirt, which was only about big enough to fit me to begin with, I start feeling something hitting the top of my head. I figured it might be like swamp water or something. I don't know. I wasn't exactly in a steady frame of mind. So I start like wiping the top of my head, only to see the biggest centipede I'd ever seen crawling on my palm. Yeah, it was gross, but I'm not particularly scared of bugs. I know those things have a nasty bite sometimes, but I just brushed it off and waited a few minutes until I figured the coast was clear. Only then did I try to move, and only then did I realize that I couldn't. I couldn't get my foot free, my pant legs held in place by something I couldn't see immediately. I tugged a little, but it didn't want to rip my pant legs, so I sort of shift a little, grab my phone, and turn on the light to see what's snagging them. When I saw it, I pulled so hard that I straight up ripped them, threw myself out of that hole, and bolted back towards our tour group. My buddy later asked how I'd managed to rip my pants escaping from the cop, and I'll tell you what I told him. When I turned and switched my phone light on, I saw a skeleton in rags, all twisted up among the roots of the tree like it had him held in place until he starved or died of thirst. I mean, that's impossible. He probably died of a wound or a snake bite or something, but my God, that scared the life out of me. There were bugs crawling in the skull's empty eye sockets, scuttling through the teeth and dropping down into the dirt. I know it was just the effect of the booze and smoke, but I swear in that moment I thought that skeleton was moving or something. I never talked about what happened that day to really anyone. I even folded my pant legs up into 3/4 lengths so that neither our teacher nor the patrolling deputy would have any clue as to what I'd come across. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers and civilians went missing during the Civil War. That much I picked up from history class that year. And I think that day down at Fort Randolph, I accidentally found one. Back when I was just 13 years old, my secondary school organized a big school trip across the English Channel to Brittany in the north of France. I was really excited to go, because my family wasn't exactly the wealthiest of the bunch. I'd never been out of the country before, not to mention that French was probably my favorite subject in school. I loved it. I loved that I was learning a new way of talking to people that I wouldn't be able to communicate with normally, that it opened up a whole new way of thinking about things too. I still loved the language, and especially the idioms or sayings that the French have. When speaking French, if something is overly sentimental, romantic, or sappy, you might say it's à l'eau de rose, which means with rose water. Or when you got loads of energy and you're really excited about something in particular, you might say avoir mangé du lion, which means to have eaten a lion. You see what I mean? It's just such a cool language, but despite being an average francophile, I must change my tone dramatically because the story I'm about to tell you is not a happy one. In fact, it might be the worst thing that had ever happened during my childhood. So as I said, every year my school organized an all-expenses-paid school trip to a place called Plaine Fougère in Brittany. It's a small village of just less than 2,000 set deep into the countryside, where students could really get to grips with the lives and cultures of everyday rural French folk. So as you can imagine, I absolutely loved it. We'd visit a small cafe most evenings to try traditional French food, and a huge part of that was ordering food en français. It was quite a challenge, but oh my word, the food was absolutely amazing, and after every meal, we'd languidly wander back to the hostel and spend a few hours just chilling in the dorm rooms, watching French TV before we went to sleep. It was honestly a dream come true for me, until one fateful morning when that beautiful Gallic dream turned into a nightmare, the likes of which none of us could have ever imagined. Even today, I remember it all like it was yesterday. When I think about it, it plays out in my head like a movie, like I can watch myself in every scene. It all started very early in the morning, just after 6, and the summer months meant that the sun lit up the hostel in such a beautiful way, in stark contrast to the mood that pervaded throughout the morning. I heard a faint sound coming from the corridor outside, a gentle hushed voice that descended into quiet sobbing as the muffled conversation between what was obviously a teacher and a student progressed ominously. I sat up in bed, straining my ears to listen, but soon found myself creeping toward the door, trying not to wake my classmates as I tried my best to find out what was going on. The words were whispered, but I knew something terrible had happened. The girl wasn't just homesick. She hadn't had a nightmare or accidentally hurt herself somehow. She was distraught, completely and utterly distraught. I only managed to discern 2 words of their entire conversation when the higher, younger voice of a fellow pupil rose in volume for a moment before it was swiftly shushed by the teacher she was talking to. I'll never forget the way she said, "She's gone, she's gone." Eventually, the conversation died down, and the girl was obviously ushered away by the teacher to be consoled and comforted somewhere much more private. I got back in bed, but I couldn't sleep. In my mind, a girl had obviously ran away, gotten so homesick that she'd ran from the hostel in some misguided attempt to, hitchhike back to England or something. It wasn't completely out of the question. If I remember rightly, the Channel Tunnel had been constructed and was being used frequently by French and British drivers alike. Either that or the girl had been kidnapped, abducted by some predatory French psychopath who had dragged her out of her dorm room during the night. But that would have woken up the entire room, surely. At least 5 girls were sleeping in the room at any one time, so there was surely no way that was possible. I found the thought reassuring, but only slightly because, whatever had happened, someone was still gone, as the girl had so horrifyingly phrased it. By the time we'd all gotten up for breakfast, I was visibly frayed around the edges, exhausted but wired, and the girls in my dorm knew that there was something amiss just from my behavior and the big black bags under my eyes. Sitting down for breakfast in the hostel's dining area, I immediately noticed that the teachers were all looking pretty shaken. Teaching staff who were normally calm to the point of boredom seemed to have transformed into downright nervous wrecks. And I also noticed nervously that 4 of our number were missing, with 4 telltale empty chairs denoting their absence. Something had definitely happened in one of our rooms overnight, but just what that thing was, I never could have imagined. Or maybe it was just the case that I could have imagined, but 13-year-old me just couldn't bring herself to consider it as a possibility. I expected our teachers to make some sort of announcement at breakfast, explaining that some of the girls had been sent back to England or something, or at least to ask us if we had any information to come forward with regarding a girl's disappearance. But they didn't. It was eating me up inside, and as the morning went on, a lot of the other girls on the trip started to notice the 5 absences of our number. Rumors began to spread. Crueler, mean girls began to make wild speculations like they were pregnant from copping off with French boys in the village. But the truth was far, far worse. We were all left in suspense for the entire day until finally, that evening, all the pupils were called into the hostel's common area in front of the entire teaching staff, some of which looked pale as ghosts, to be told the bad news. "Girls," one teacher began, her voice breaking as she spoke. I don't know how to tell you this, and I'm so sorry that I have to. But Caroline is gone. She died during the night." But that wasn't quite the truth, and we didn't learn of what really had happened until we got back to England and the media frenzy began. You see, Caroline hadn't simply died during the night. She had been assaulted and murdered, and some of the other 4 girls sleeping in her room at the time of the attack had actually witnessed her killing, despite the fact that they hadn't been able to properly discern what was going on. A classmate of ours who was sleeping in the bottom bunk opposite the door says she woke up at 3 a.m., disturbed by a noise that was coming from Caroline's bunk. She said it sounded like a soft wailing or moaning. In the dark, she glanced over towards Caroline's bunk and saw what she thought was her kicking in her sleeping bag. But when she heard what sounded like the zip of her sleeping bag being undone, she concluded Caroline had woken up from a nightmare and unzipped her sleeping bag due to the heat of the summer night. The police investigation that followed was traumatic to say the least, mainly because so many of us had close encounters with her murderer who had apparently just slipped away into the night, never to be seen again. Another girl who was staying in the room just opposite Caroline's said that she had gotten up in the night to go to the toilet and had bumped into an older man with straggly hair and bushy eyebrows on the stairs. She later told us that she remembers the glare of the man and how he snickered quietly before disappearing from view. She also mentioned hearing heavy footsteps outside on the gravel, which was obviously the man escaping the scene of the crime. There were so very many opportunities for us to prevent what had happened, or to at least catch the guy that had done it, but we didn't. Out of ignorance and naivety, we didn't, and Caroline was dead because of it. It took 5 long years for justice to be done, but in March of 2001, the case was classed as unsolved until an immigration official at Detroit Airport named Tommy Onko read about the story in a British newspaper, who were marking the 5-year anniversary of the murder. The article named a man named Francisco Montes as a possible suspect, and for whatever reason, Tommy Onko decided to do an immigration search to see if a man by that name had ever traveled to the United States. He found that Francisco Montes had indeed traveled to the States, was in fact still there, and happened to be in police custody down Miami Beach. Onko contacted the French and British authorities and was able to confirm Montez's date of birth and hometown. Montez had been arrested in Miami Beach for a lewd and lascivious assault on a female Irish tourist at a youth hostel, and the crime had a remarkably similar modus operandi to Caroline's murder, as Montez was able to enter the girl's bedroom quietly enough for the victim or her roommates to remain oblivious to his presence. Montez was arrested by Sergeant Angel Vasquez of the Miami Beach Police Department. Vasquez obtained a DNA sample from the suspect, which was then matched to sample DNA from the youth hostel attack on the Irish student. In addition, Major Vasquez linked Montez to 4 other similar incidents on Miami Beach, and then to the DNA sample from Caroline's murder scene. The prosecution in America was then halted so that Montez could be extradited to France to stand charges for Caroline's grisly murder. And I later read that Francisco Montes told French investigators that he had a miserable childhood. Apparently he was born the only son of middle-class parents who ran a small grocery store in Spain. During his teenage years, and as a symptom of his deteriorating mental health, he began to obsess over his personal hygiene, doing things such as operating doorknobs and light switches with a handkerchief. And in 1970, at just 20 years of age, Montez exposed himself to a neighbor. He was arrested for this exposure and, as a part of his processing, was diagnosed with depression and progressive schizophrenia. But his urges were uncontrollable, I guess. Because later in 1981, Montez broke into the room of a girl in a youth hostel in the Netherlands and touched her inappropriately and against her wishes. Montez was actually jailed in Germany during the mid-1980s for armed indecent assault, but still, he was unable to control his maniacal urges, leaving a swath of other offenses across Europe. At Montez's first trial in the French city of Rennes during June of 2004, where he was jailed for 30 years, Montez barely spoke. Yet after an appeal that resulted in a second trial in June of 2005, he stated that he had no intention of killing the girl when he entered her dormitory at the youth hostel. He had put his hand over her mouth to stifle her cries when he assaulted her. He said he had no intention of killing Caroline, that it was an accident, a misfortune, I guess. Montez, described to the appeal court as a predator, said he had not demanded the second trial for his own sake, that he merely wished to tell Caroline's family what had really happened that night. Yes, it is true, I killed her, but I had no intention of killing her. It was an accident, a misfortune. It was the result of the assault. I didn't go into her room to kill her. I didn't cover her mouth to kill her. First, I'd like to say that I am appealing because I want to explain what happened on that day and the previous days. That wasn't the case in Rennes. I didn't give any explanation. Montez said that after taking tranquilizers and alcohol, he had gone to a youth hostel at Saint-Lunaire, where he had tried to assault another English girl. He fled when her companions woke and went to the hostel at Plaine Fougère, where he had found Caroline. Caroline's father, John, who I had seen around Parents' Evening and Sports Day, took the stand to tell the courtroom that he would be haunted all his life by the memory of seeing his daughter's body in the morgue. Life has stuck at the same page for 9 years, he tearfully said. He was followed by Caroline's younger sister, Jenny, who spoke in public for the first time about the loss of her best friend. Jenny was only 11 years old when she died and said it had taken 6 long years before she could bring herself to talk about her loss. Montez appeared to wipe away a tear as she finished giving her testimony. And that's the story of the worst time in my life so far. It's something I've followed in the news almost obsessively after the news of Montez's arrest hit the airwaves. The fact we didn't know what had really happened or who had murdered her was something that almost destroyed our young lives, not to mention the existential guilt of knowing we could have stopped it. Some of you may be pleased to hear that Montez's appeal was not upheld, and that the judge determined that he will serve a minimum of 20 years in a French prison for Caroline's murder. Some might argue that such a prolific deviant should serve much, much longer. And I shall end this by saying something I was unable to say for 9 long years of my life. Repose en paix, Caroline. May you rest in peace. For a good few years, I was a teacher at Lansdowne Middle School in Victoria, British Columbia. I loved my job. Teaching wasn't something I'd ever really seen myself doing. It certainly wasn't a career I'd talked about with high school guidance counselors. I kind of fell into it by accident. Long story short, I couldn't get into the college I wanted to, so I had to basically choose between that and nursing, so I chose the one with less blood and guts involved. Every year, we take a bunch of grade 8 students up to a place called Camp Barnard at Otter Point, just west of Souk. It's a scout camp built on land gifted by Senator George Henry Barnard, who was a prominent advocate of hunting and outdoor activities in general. There are a lot of fun things for the kids to get up to up at the camp. There's a playing field, a nature trail, a swimming pool, a lake for canoeing and paddleboarding, even an archery range and disc golf course. The kids absolutely adore heading up there for a few days, and there's always a palpable feeling of excitement every year in the run-up to the field trip up there. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't look forward to it too. That kind of stuff really brings out the big kid in me, you know? It was the last week of the school year when we piled onto a bus and drove over to the camp to begin our few days of fun. The weather is normally pretty peachy during that time of year, but last year, there were some unusually strong winds blowing through the camp. This was very disappointing. as it meant that some of the activities would be totally out of the question. You can't play disc golf when the winds can effectively blow your disc right off the entire course, and neither can you paddleboard when your board keeps getting flipped over by choppy waters. That only really left a handful of activities open to the kids, one of which was archery, the other was orienteering. I'll be honest, I was excited to try archery again. I'd tried it the year before the first time, and I'd actually fought to get assigned to it again since I'd just found the whole thing so cool. I had my reservations about the wind, but they were purely minor concerns about it affecting the kids' accuracy. It'd really suck if a few of the more talented archers were unable to nail a bullseye or two thanks to the winds. But these were thin, polycarbon projectiles. I doubted the wind would have any serious effect on them. But it wasn't the wind I had to worry about. You see, we had this one kid with us who was a real klutz. They sucked at sports, always seemed to be that kid who ended up in the nurse's office from falling in the schoolyard. Everybody knows a kid like that, right? And this was our clumsy kid. So the kid, who I won't name to protect their future reputations, steps up to the firing line with their bow and arrow in hand, fires off a couple of terrible shots, but I'm quick to offer encouragement. The instructor even takes a little more time to show him the correct stance, how to stand just right so that the arrow flies straight and true towards its target. But when the kid tries to imitate the instructor, he takes up the goofiest pose I think I'd ever seen. Body turned sideways, legs spread way too far apart, and they even instinctually squatted down as if to try to lower their center of gravity, as if that was going to help in the slightest. Then, just before they're about to shoot off another arrow, this huge, and I mean huge gust of wind starts tearing its way through the camp, and I watched in horror as the kid began to sway, falling backwards and shooting his arrow way off target. The instructor kept his cool, managed to keep the kids from freaking out, but immediately shot me a look as if to say, time to call it a day. Next came the orienteering, about the only truly safe thing to do during this kind of weather. At least, that's what I thought anyway. Sure, the maps were flapping away in our hands as we tried to navigate our way around the course, but it was still pretty fun despite the weather. Fun, right up until I heard a crashing sound coming from just over a rise. The kids I was supervising looked around in confusion, their eyes full of fear as they wondered aloud what the sound was. I told them I wasn't sure, and we'd have to wait to check it out once the course had been completed. But that was a lie. I knew. I knew well what it was. I'd heard it before. It was the sound of a tree falling in the woods. It's frankly unmistakable, a deep, wrenching sound, then the clacking of the lumber hitting other upright trees before the final crash as it hits the dirt. I had this horrible feeling in my gut. There were kids all over the area, all taking part in the orienteering exercise in small groups, each overseen by a member of the camp or teaching staff. And it was probably the worst moment of my life so far to realize that my worst fears had come true. I saw a kid bounding over the rise, his eyes, these big, white circles beaming out from his terrified face. I called after him, trying to get him to tell me what had just happened, and he didn't say anything. He just sprinted back towards camp as fast as his little legs could carry him. I tried to keep the kids from worrying too much, but they couldn't concentrate on the task at hand. They seemed to know something was horribly wrong just as clearly as I did. So, after a few more minutes of trying to control the situation, I just walked us all back to camp to try to get them settled in their bunks. I'll just cut to the chase at this point. The fallen tree had landed right on one of the kids, who I won't name to protect their family. And, believe it or not, he was dead just moments later from massive chest trauma and asphyxiation. The school district's critical incident response team was deployed on the Wednesday afternoon to support students, staff, and families. But with the yearly graduation ceremony that was only a week away, it was completely ruined for a lot of families, and even those that attended felt a sense of pervading sorrow and loss. And as for me, I've never really gotten over the fact that such horrifically random tragedies can occur to completely innocent children. I took advantage of the free counseling services provided by the school district, but they just didn't seem to help. I found myself looking at kids, wondering what completely random accident would take their lives before they even blossomed into fully grown adults. My story takes place in August of 2011, a time that is burned into my memory and will be for the rest of my natural life. From the ages of 13 to 18, I attended Eton College here in England. It's an independent boys' boarding school near Windsor here in Berkshire, where I was born and raised. Founded in 1440 by King Henry VI as a sister institution to King's College, Cambridge, it's one of the oldest and most prestigious schools in the entire UK, perhaps even the world, and charges up to £42,500 a year, which is $53,480 for any Americans reading this. Following the old public school tradition, Eton is a full boarding school, which means pupils live at the school 7 days a week. Eton has educated prime ministers, world leaders, Nobel laureates, and generations of the aristocracy. Naturally, we're a very privileged bunch. I understand that term has become something of a thinly veiled insult over the past couple of years, but I really don't mind applying it to myself. I know how lucky I am to have grown up in such extraordinary circumstances, and what is essentially a Harry Potter film come to life. I had many opportunities to great things at Eton, some of which are organized by the BSES, the British Schools Exploration Society. They're an organization that organizes school trips to various explorative expeditions to many far-flung regions of the globe. But I imagine you all could have figured that out for yourselves. The point being, one year the BSES announced that it would be taking pupils to the Norwegian Arctic Circle to explore the frigid wastes, accompanied by a group of professional Arctic trekkers who would teach us the tricks of their rigorous trade. It was something I dreamed of doing ever since I had read of the polar expeditions of Captain Scott when I was a much younger child. So naturally, I jumped at the opportunity. I begged and pleaded with my parents to allow me to go, and despite their reservations at permitting their only son to take part in something so dangerous, they eventually agreed. I was ecstatic. I was set to follow in the footsteps of some of my all-time heroes, and I literally counted the days off on a specially bought calendar until the day finally came when we embarked on the adventure of a lifetime. We arrived on the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard on the first day of August 2011. I don't think words can even describe how cold it was. I, for one, had never felt anything like it. It made even the most frigid Scottish nights seem relatively balmy in comparison. It was a dry cold, one that shocked your lungs when you first breathed in the air there. We received a great deal of orientation before we eventually embarked on the trek north, with the professionals among us breaking down everything we needed to know to survive in the frozen north. I know it was a very necessary part of our journey, but I found the whole process somewhat of a frustration. Half the stuff they told us were things I already knew. But for the good of my fellow junior trekkers, I kept my mouth shut and retained my patience. The things we saw on that great march northward, they are things that I am glad I can never unsee. In that area of the world, it is so cold that the ice isn't just white. It's almost like a light blue. Such is the intensity of the frost. It's a beauty that is quite unlike anything else. Witnessing the palette that nature is able to paint with is as humbling as it is enlightening. On the fourth day of our trek, we found ourselves near the Van Post Glacier, some 25 miles from the settlement of Longyearbyen. Ah yes, it was the 5th of August when we made camp just near the Van Post Glacier. We put up our tents and set about preparing for another insanely cold night, heating up rations, repairing our gear, and fortifying ourselves against the frost with schnapps and scotch. Some of us were under the age of 18 at the time, but the laws of man barely apply in places like Svalbard, where it is better to become comfortable and alive than law-abiding and miserable. I remember sharing a nip with my friend Horatio, who attended Eton just as I did. He was a big lad, strong and tough, I always resented the accusations that public school boys were just posh southern ponces. It was our forefathers that were the first over the top of the trenches at Somme, Ypres, and Passchendaele, and Horatio was cut from the same cloth. We chatted for a while, shared our thoughts on the trip thus far, then bid each other good night before returning to our tents to get some well-deserved rest. And it was the last time I saw him alive. That night, we woke to the sound of screaming. There were screams of fear, screams of rage, but what cut above them all were the blood-curdling, stomach-churning screams of pure, mortal agony. I'll never forget what I saw when I unzipped that tent that night. What was illuminated under torch beams. It was a nightmarish vision. A huge, haggard creature was half buried in one of the tents, the fabric of which billowed as the thing inside thrashed and ripped and tore at the tent's occupants. "Shoot it, Spike. Shoot it now," came a cry I remember hearing. "I can't, for Christ's sake, the bloody safety's jammed." And that was the voice of Spike Reed, one of the pros accompanying us in the expedition's second in command. When he finally got the safety catch on the rifle off, he trudged through the snow towards the great lumbering beast to get a clear and perfect shot, who somehow detected his presence and backed out of the tent to greet him. And only then did I see what it was. It honestly looked like a monster, right out of a horror film. It was emaciated, half-blind, a torn-up face with jagged teeth exposed. But it was clearly a polar bear, and it rushed Spike with alarming speed and agility from something on the verge of death. It swiped at his upper body, connecting with one wicked strike that sent him flying backwards. Maybe it was the horror of the moment that's tainted my recollection, but I'm almost certain I saw his blood spray in that torchlight, to be honest with you. But Spike handled that rifle well, even though he'd been almost torn open by a single swipe of that polar bear's powerful arm and razor-sharp claws. Afterwards, he told us it was almost like a happy accident, that the ground underneath his back made it easier to aim, made it so he wasn't shaking quite as much as he brought the barrel up to the bear's head and fired. We tried to tend to the wounded, but my God, the injuries that they'd suffered. One of the lads in the tent that was attacked had been literally torn apart, limb from limb. I'd never seen such a horrifying mess of shredded flesh, blood, and guts in all of my life. It was like the floor of a butcher's shop, and around them, the snow soaked up the blood. I could barely recognize the victim, but I slowly realized in horrified disgust who it was, purely from looking at the lad's clothing. It was Horatio. A rescue helicopter was dispatched from Longyearbyen that arrived within about 40 minutes of the initial attack, transporting the wounded to Tromsø on mainland Norway for extensive emergency medical treatment. But Horatio was killed in mere moments from massive trauma to his essential organs. I thought I might take a moment to explain to you all why things went so horribly wrong. A tragedy like that should have been entirely preventable for a number of reasons. Firstly, it is common practice for groups like ours to post night watchmen to ensure that there can be no approach by predatory animals or people with malintent. However, the night in question was so foggy that it would have been pointless to do so. There's no point keeping watch when you can only watch about 5 meters in front of your face. In lieu of a night watchman, we set tripwires with deterrent explosives attached. The idea being, if an animal triggers them, the loud bang both wakes us up to prepare to defend ourselves, as well as scaring the predator or predators away. But we discovered that the tripwires had indeed been triggered, that the polar bear had indeed stepped on them, but the fog in the air meant the explosives were basically sodden, so much so that they completely failed to fire off when triggered. There was talk of suing the manufacturer, but I'm not sure any legal suit was ever filed against them, not with how occupied everyone was with the investigations that followed. But it was a farce, conducted by people who had probably never been on a country walk, let alone ventured into the frigid wastes of the Arctic. For example, following an inquiry by Norwegian investigators, officials ruled that the attack could have been prevented if the expedition members had stayed in cabins instead of tents. Cabins. We were supposed to have had the time, resources, or energy to pull a bloody log cabin out of our collective butts. Bollocks. It was almost a slap in the face to hear them come out with something like that. I think I've talked enough by this point. I think this is the place to leave it before I get too angry or upset about how the whole thing unfolded, about how bloody well preventable the whole thing was. But I suppose that's how life happens sometimes. How life seems to find a way for the absolutely tragic to become horribly possible. First things first, English is not my first language. I am in fact from Sweden, so if there are any mistakes in my writing, I'm very sorry. This is also not the easiest thing to talk on because this story is of one of my worst days of my life so far. As I said, I'm Swedish and I'm also a teacher at a high school here in Angskolen High School in Huena, a town about 100 kilometers southeast of the city of Gothenburg. As you probably know, we have a lot of snow here in Sweden, and everyone knows what the best thing to do in the snow is, right? That's correct. Skiing. We love skiing here in Sweden, as sometimes it is too cold and snowy to do anything else. So what many schools do during the winter and the spring, when the weather is too bad to play other sports outside, is organize regular skiing trips to various resorts that help to build bonds between the students and teachers, as well as keeping us all fit and healthy. So one early Sunday morning in April, we all met up outside of the high school to get onto a bus that would take us to the ski resort he had picked out for the kids and ourselves. There were 52 of us all in all, including the driver, with 6 teachers to supervise roughly 8 children each. With skiing being a rather hazardous activity, this kind of supervision is essential to ensure safety. We were on a main highway south of Sveg, a small rural town, when we began to notice a lot of icy road ahead of us. Usually we are very good at dealing with the cold weather here in Sweden, but the further out into the countryside you get, the scarcer some of the de-icing infrastructure can be. One of the teachers mentioned it to the driver, telling him to be careful, that the speeds he was driving at were definitely not safe on the icy roads. He grumbled something obscene about being a better driver than we give him credit for and carried on going at the same speed. The teacher quieted down after this, not wanting to anger the bus driver any further, but looking back, we should have said something more that might have avoided what had happened. Because just a few miles down the road, we felt the bus begin to skid. This happens from time to time on icy roads, yes, but the driver was not nearly as skilled as he claimed to be. He wrestled with the wheel, but it was no good. The bus tipped onto its side and sent children flying out of their seats. We had warned them to wear seatbelts, but some of them didn't listen, choosing instead to sit on top of the seats on their knees to talk to the children behind them. And it was chaos. Complete and utter chaos. The bus span almost 180 degrees on the road, sending bodies toppling over seats and children alike before finally coming to a stop on the side of the road. In the end, 3 children were dead, and 20 others were varying degrees of injured. The worst part was seeing the children trying to wake up their dead friends, begging and pleading with them to open their eyes or talk or sit up. But they couldn't. The impact had cracked some of their skulls, broken their necks, smashed broken ribs into lungs, and caused them to fill with blood. It was the worst thing I'd ever seen in my entire life. And in the aftermath of the crash, our country went into mourning. Our Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, said the accident leaves me and the whole country in sorrow. There was extensive outreach between the teacher staff of our school and the parents of the children killed or injured. One of the children's parents told me his daughter had called him as soon as she was able, that he had woken up to the sound of her screams on the phone. He also said that he could still hear her screams if he listened hard enough, clear as day, many weeks later. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, because I don't.